I'm Stephen Overley. I'm the editorial director of Politico Live. I also host the Politico Tech podcast. And I'm joined today by a very experienced panel that I'm hoping we can look at this manufacturing and trade issue from a variety of different perspectives. I'll quickly introduce our panelists here. We have Pennsylvania Congressman Chris Deluzio, who sits on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Thea, who is the former Deputy Undersecretary of International Affairs during the Biden administration. And finally, we have Gilbert Kaplan, who is the former Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade during the first Trump administration and is now a Senior Manufacturing Fellow at Indiana University. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
I want to start with some news from earlier this week, which is that US and Chinese trade negotiators reached an agreement to lower tariffs, at least for now, and to continue trade talks. Congressman, I'll come to you first. Is this a good thing?
Maybe. I would have approached trade in a very different way than the president has, as you can imagine. I think tariffs alone and across the board were a mistake. I'm someone who believes in targeted enforcement against countries like China that have broken the rules in sectors that are important to our national security and otherwise. And so I say maybe because I think China's where this should have started. With focused efforts on enforcement, paired with the part that I think is missing here at home, industrial policy, investment in our workforce, encouraging investment domestically and foreign investment for manufacturing. That's been missing from Trump's tariffs alone approach. And I have also been someone who thinks the president should have closed the de minimis loophole across the board with China, certainly for several reasons, but also the risk of fentanyl and fentanyl precursors coming in. He's left open the inspection piece of this. I know that's been part of the negotiation. I think that should have been closed. I urge President Biden to do the same. And so my answer of maybe is, well, it's complicated. And I think, again, I would have started in a very different way strategically, focusing on countries like China that have been breaking the rules and pairing it with much better policy here at home.
Well, let me ask you a quick follow-up on that, because I know you have written that Democrats should not just be against tariffs wholesale. Are 125% tariffs on Chinese goods, given everything we import from China, something that the party should be behind?
President Trump's approach here has been, I think, a mistake, and I think your question gets to it, right? Tariffs alone aren't enough, right? Tariffs might play a role in a country like China as an enforcement tool, which I would be supportive of, especially in sectors like shipbuilding and steel, which have an important national security component. But tariffs aren't going to do the work alone, especially if we have sectors where there isn't a manufacturing capacity we can flip a switch here at home or with our friends. And so, as I say, it depends, and it might be sector specific, which to me gets to the problem of an across-the-board approach, even when you're talking just a country like China and the president trying to negotiate China alone.
You know, it's not lost on me that there's not a whole lot that Trump and former President Biden agree on. They diverge on a lot of policy. Trade with China, though, there is a lot of consistency. Both had tariffs, both had export controls. Thea, I'll come to you. Do you see a lot of daylight on this issue between what Trump is doing, Trump's approach, and Biden's approach?
Actually, I do see a lot of daylight between them. And it's interesting, I agree with Congressman Deluzio that tariffs themselves are a perfectly useful tool. It's like having a screwdriver in your toolbox. But if you take it and throw it through the plate glass window, you're no longer using that tool effectively. So I think that the Biden approach was designed, it was a little bit more judicious and slow, which may be too slow, but also building the industrial policy, investing in infrastructure, investing in clean energy, investing in good jobs in the United States, which is really the opposite of what Donald Trump has done. And I think the across-the-board tariffs need to be judicious, strategic, and they need to communicate a purpose. There are many behaviors that China has that are extremely problematic for American workers and American businesses. Wholesale violation of labor rights, including genocide in the Xinjiang region, subsidization of export sectors, in the past, currency manipulation. All of those things are legitimate trade problems. But when you put an across-the-board tariff of 145%, you don't communicate to China, and you don't communicate to American businesses what you want them to do differently. So in order to be effective, you need to have consistency, clarity, and I think what's happening now with the bilateral secret deals that are happening with all of our trading partners, this is the opposite of the way the project should be. Congress needs to have a role. Congress is constitutionally given that role in trade policy. They need to be able to know What are we trading on? What are we asking for? What are we getting? Are we prioritizing, let's say, labor rights? I haven't really heard a lot about labor rights and forced labor and other egregious labor practices that we might use tariffs effectively to address, and that would be good for American business, it would be good for American workers, it would create the kind of global economy we want to live in. But what we've done instead, we have chaos. And chaos isn't conducive to business, and it's not conducive to bringing jobs home, because in order to bring jobs home, which is, of course, we all share that goal, we want to bring good jobs home to the United States, you need to tell the companies what the policy is going to be for the next 5 or 10 years so that they can plan accordingly. They can invest in a factory, invest in a workforce, invest in infrastructure.
Gilbert, I want to come to you, but Thea, a quick follow-up, just because I picked up on something you said there, mentioning maybe some of Biden's policies were too slow. I'm curious if you're referring to something specific there, if you feel like we might be in a different position on trade and manufacturing if the administration had done certain things faster.
Well, I think the Biden administration was cautious because they were trying to balance the interests of business and workers and our trading partners and be in conversation. And I think most of that is correct. In order to have a tariff policy, as Congressman Deluzio said, you need to be able to look sector by sector. That doesn't happen quickly. You know, there are some sectors where we don't produce and we don't want to produce something anymore. So there's no point having a tariff there. There's other sectors where it's sensitive and there's a real possibility. So, you know, I think that what the Biden administration did was correct in trying to build a worker-centered trade policy, in trying to begin an industrial policy. Sure, I wish everything had gone faster, and I wish we had done that. Donald Trump broke things. In his first term, he broke trade policy, and that actually created the opportunity for making some needed changes. But in the second term, he's smashed the infrastructure and the confidence and the relationships that we have with our trading partners, and the confidence and the ability to plan of the business community. And that's not going to work.
Gilbert, I'll come to you to respond to that, because you were part of sort of breaking trade policy then in the first term. What do you see now? Is it chaos? Are businesses sort of at a loss for what to do here?
Well, I'd say, first of all, you have to start with a fundamental fact, which is the trade system was very harmful for a lot of manufacturers, going back even before the WTO, but certainly since the WTO and certainly since China joined the WTO. We just could not, without an enormous amount of expense in the case of trade cases or very unusual solutions, do anything for a lot of manufacturers. So we had to do something different in the international trade area. That's not the only area, as both Thea and the congressman have mentioned, that you have to work on to build up manufacturing. But we needed to change the international trade system. And I think what the president has done in putting these tariffs on sends a very strong signal on sort of that leg of the stool, that we are not going to put up with unfair trade for the rest of time, which is what we have had to do in many industries. In terms of the China agreement, I worked on the Phase 1 agreement. I've worked on loads of trade agreements. I think what we need with China is to forget about all this language like, you know, you won't do this or you will do this. We need managed trade. We need to make a decision with China what we will buy from them and vice versa. And with that managed trade, starting wherever we are right now, we should slowly remove the enormous trade deficit in manufactured products with China, and we should build up industries that we need here in the United States. With that managed trade system and then doing a few things in the United States, we need to provide capital for industries that have been driven out of business or haven't even been able to start because of the unfair trade actions. This was the goal of the CHIPS Act, and I hope that remains in effect and those fabs are built. And the biggest single problem manufacturing faces in the United States right now is workforce. There are no workers or limited workers that want to go to work in the factories. And I'm involved with Indiana University. I always ask the kids, what do you want? They say, we want to do something important. We want to make a change. we have to convince people from universities, but also people who are going to community colleges or maybe not going to college at all, that contributing to the American manufacturing base is important right now. It's critical to the 21st century for the United States.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on that because I completely agree with Gil. Gil and I have known each other for a long time, working on bringing more good manufacturing jobs back to the United States. I think as we think about the workforce, one of the key things we have to think about is President Trump talks about bringing jobs home. We need to talk about bringing good jobs home and making sure that when we bring jobs home, that workers have the right to form a union, they have a safe and healthy workplace, that they are able to make a living. And I think the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act were really good steps along the way, creating jobs in blue and red states. But President Trump is simultaneously destroying the Department of Labor and its enforcement capacity. And so I see a lot of contradictions in the rhetoric around bringing jobs home, but an absolute lack of concern for whether those are good jobs and how we treat American workers. We don't want to bring jobs home so that we can recreate the third world labor markets here in the United States. That's not the goal.
Congressman, I want to come to you here because we've talked about, or we've mentioned here, the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, included a lot of money for domestic manufacturing in sectors that are seen as vital to the future of the U.S. economy. We're seeing Trump try to walk that money back, though, right, and revoke some of those programs. Is he shooting himself in the foot here? Is this a contradiction to his ambitions around manufacturing?
I think it'd be foolish. I'll give you just two examples from my district in Western Pennsylvania. Mitsubishi Electric putting a big investment in, I think 200 permanent jobs planned to help us build out things like switchgears. This is about renewable energy and grid capacity. Another company that had restarted operations at an old closed steel facility, now making steel components for solar trackers tracking the sun, both relying on Inflation Reduction Act tax credits. Those are jobs. That is how we are meeting our energy goals and our energy security that we need. And I think it is attracting both investment here at home and foreign investment into a place like Western Pennsylvania to grow jobs, to do the kinds of things we need to do. That's the industrial policy side of this. And so if on the one hand, you're smashing everybody with tariffs, on the other, you're ripping out industrial policy, we're not going to grow American jobs or good American jobs that we need.
Gilbert, do you see it the same way? I mean, should Trump be revoking this money in these programs?
I think the CHIPS Act was a great thing, and I worked on it to some degree, not for any specific client or anything, but I think it was a really good example of what we should be doing to help U.S. manufacturing. It's not, so broad-based that it covers the entire manufacturing sector. We made a choice that we need to be in the lead on high-end semiconductors, which we do, particularly given the importance of AI. NVIDIA, which everyone talks about as an enormous company, does not make any semiconductors, first of all. The semiconductors they use are all made in Taiwan. So we have to bring back the cutting edge of semiconductors. So the idea of putting a certain amount of money to help equalize the subsidies in foreign countries, to get U.S. companies to build here, to make sure we give them the permits and get them going on the ground quickly. That's one thing Biden didn't do. It took a long time to get the money out of the CHIPS Act. No one quite knows why. We've got to have programs in specific sectors like semiconductors.
Yeah, Thea.
Can I just jump in on the manufacturing? Because I think another point that's really important is that when we think about bringing manufacturing home or revitalizing the manufacturing sector, we really aren't thinking about it. We shouldn't be thinking in a nostalgic way, like we're going to recreate the 1950s. Because first of all, it wasn't that great, and a lot of people were left out. And second of all, we're in a different world now. So thinking to the future, to semiconductors, to cutting-edge technology, which we have not done for several decades, is going to, as Gil said correctly, is going to require actually a massive intervention and support from the government. And that's what Donald Trump is destroying right now. So we need to think forward. We need to recognize that the manufacturing jobs are much more capital intensive than they used to be. So they're not massive job creators. But back to the point about skills and workforce development, I would love to see American workers be ready to do the leading edge technological work that goes with complicated cutting edge manufacturing, as opposed to just thinking about like having a lot more screw turners, because that's not what manufacturing looks like today.
Let me ask you a follow-up there, though, and I'm going to be a cynical journalist here. You know, I have to wonder from a labor perspective whether this is somewhat of a dead end, because if you think about a product like the iPhone, right? You know, there's been all these calculations around the tariffs. What would it cost to manufacture an iPhone in the United States using U.S. workers? And the costs were astronomical. It would make it cost prohibitive for most people to buy an iPhone. That sort of raises the question to me, can you really do high-tech manufacturing in the US when there will always be cheaper labor elsewhere?
Absolutely, but you have to be strategic and judicious. And so it might not be iPhones, but certainly cars, which are very, technologically, and clean energy. I mean, you think about sort of what are the sectors of the future, and you think about having fewer jobs, but very well-paid jobs, very highly skilled jobs, that is something that is totally doable in the United States, and we should not sell ourselves short in that front.
Well, and I want to say, and Gil, I agree with you about the CHIPS Act. I think it's critically important. Beijing hates it, which tells us something about the fact that it's a good policy. But you get to another point you brought up, right? It's one thing to diversify where these things are made. We need to make more of them here. It is a problem that one company controls so much of that production, even if they're making more of it here at home. It gets to an antitrust problem.
Right.
Monopolies can be really bad for competition and growth, but can also be counterproductive to our national security. And so I think there's an antitrust component here of more vibrant, competitive manufacturing here at home as we help American companies and friendly foreign companies that want to invest compete with governments that are propping up and subsidizing their own industries.
What kind of faith do you have in the DOJ and the FTC and this administration to be a strong enforcer on antitrust policy?
Mixed messages, frankly, so far. Some notes of optimism and some decisions that I think are foolish. And so I'm keeping open mind. And I think what we saw from the FTC and the DOJ antitrust division under Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor, respectively, was where I think this administration should continue things. And again, there have been some moves in that direction and some moves, as Thea says, on the labor front that are completely the other direction of anti-worker. And so I'm hopeful we'll see more movement to continue good pro-worker, pro-consumer, pro-small business enforcement.
I want to continue on sort of this idea of enforcement, but also oversight. I covered trade under the Biden administration. There was, frankly, a degree of annoyance on the Hill from both Democrats and Republicans who did not quite see eye to eye on the new worker-centered trade policy that Biden was touting. And there were calls at that time for more oversight, that Congress has some control over trade and they should exert that authority. We're hearing that now again under Trump, this introduction of the Trade Review Act, for instance, which, may not go anywhere given Republicans control Congress. But I'm curious what oversight you would like to see of tariff policy, of trade policy.
The devil will be in the details. And as you know, there are a bunch of different approaches right now, even in the Congress, to us taking back some power. What I don't want to see is this, and frankly, the president's misuse of the tariff tool, be used as a screen to go back to an unending free trade that doesn't think about the way workers are treated here or anywhere else in the world, or doesn't think about, frankly, the way other countries and industries treat the planet we live in. That's part of this too. And so the specifics of what we might see and how that will play out will matter more than the goal. And I think Congress, I'm not just talking trade policy, the Congress has given away too much power to the executive across parties for a long time. War making is a place that comes to mind. I could go on. And so I think the Congress being more muscular across parties is something I want to see. And again, the devil will be in the details on what happens on trade.
Gilbert, what do you think here? I mean, is Congress going to make trade policy better, more efficient?
Well, I think what Congress needs to do is pass a trade bill that really takes on some of the same things the president is trying to take on. This history of unfair trade, I've represented maybe 20 different industries. And at some point I realized when they come in, they all have the same problem. There's subsidies in foreign countries. There's low-cost goods that are selling for less than their input costs in the United States. I can't tell you how many CEOs came and said, I make this lighting fixture, and the Chinese are sending it in for the cost of my inputs, much less anything I have to do to put them together and make a profit. And the Congress hasn't done that. So the president had to do it. I think one great advantage of the tariffs, and this is really interesting, is it's putting the penalty for failing to deal with unfair trade right up front. So when even the UK or the Chinese come in, they know that if they don't make a good deal, these tariffs are going to go on. When we negotiated most other agreements, I negotiated the US-Japan agreement on trade and semiconductors, the Phase 1 agreement, don't come to a deal, we're going to talk to the White House and they're going to take some action against you. And 9 out of 10 times they didn't take the action and nobody believed it while we were negotiating anyway. Here, the action is on the table. So I think we're going to get a lot better deals. And I don't think the tariffs are going to stick around very long. I think it's pretty clear the tariffs are going to be gone. That's maybe not what the president originally intended, but I think we're going to go into an age of bilateral trade agreements that look very specifically at what needs to be done. And I think if Congress had acted and passed a trade bill that challenged the WTO and challenged what we had to do in terms of manufacturing, they'd be more in the lead, but they have not done that.
Just a quick follow-up, and then I'll come to you, Thea. But we mentioned the Phase 1 deal, which you were involved with China. There are a lot of economists who say that did not work, that China did not deliver on its commitments or hold up its end of the bargain. I mean, what do these trade deals that Trump is negotiating now need to include if they are going to really move the needle on manufacturing here in the U.S.?
I think there are 4 or 5 things. Starting kind of at the end of the process, they need a very good enforcement mechanism. And the mechanism should be what I call a snapback, which is if they don't follow what they agree to do in these deals, we will put the tariffs back on. And it's not going to be a 2.5-year negotiation as to whether we should. We're just going to do it. Secondly, we need reciprocal tariff rates. It doesn't have to be 1 for 1 on every product. The tariff on plastic bottles could be different in the United States and China. But basically, it has to be at the same level. When we joined the WTO, this is getting pretty technical, we agreed to do something called most favored nation, where anybody else who joins the WTO gets the very lowest rate that the United States gives to everyone. And that forced us to give the same tariff rates to China as we give to like UK or Australia, which is crazy. And there are a lot of rules like that which are really bad. We have to do managed trade. Some of that is already in the UK agreement. The tariff rate quotas are a kind of managed trade. We have to be prepared to do that. And we have to be very strong on export subsidies, which the WTO has written that out of the law. You cannot find a subsidy which they will call an export subsidy. We have to prohibit large buildups of industry in China and elsewhere which are designed to export enormous amount of products to the United States.
Thea, from your perspective, what do you want to see in these trade deals? I mean, what would make them pro-American worker? What would make them bring back and revitalize some of these industries we've been talking about today?
Well, first of all, I am concerned about the secrecy. Bilateral, one-on-one, secret trade deals that are happening behind closed doors and then just get announced one day with a tweet or something else is not the way to do trade policy, because it actually requires not just input from Congress, and Congress has a lot of different constituents to think about and can slow things down, but also we have trade advisory committees, including a labor advisory committee and different sectoral committees. And in general, when we make trade policy, we want to make sure that the stakeholders are able to say, wait a minute, you're making a mistake here because you're lowering the tariff or you're raising a tariff on this good, but we don't make it, we don't want to make it. That doesn't make any sense. And so there is a certain amount of deliberateness which is needed in order to do that, but also transparency. And so I think what happens is the bilateral agreements lend themselves to corruption, to self-dealing, and so on. So obviously labor rights is what I've spent 30 years of my career working on, including stronger and more enforceable and sanctionable clauses in all of our trade agreements and our preference programs. And I do think that remains a very important piece of what trade policy should do, because a lot of why American workers and businesses are disadvantaged in the global economy because we're competing with slave labor, we're competing with child labor, we're competing with workers who get fired or beaten up or murdered for raising their voice and saying they need a pair of safety goggles or they need a bathroom break. And that's not right. We can't be in a global economy where workers' rights are trampled every day, and we can't expect to be able to compete effectively. So I do think that that was a big focus, as we know, of the Biden administration. The Trump administration, the first Trump administration with the US-Mexico-Canada agreement recognized that and had a very strong, the strongest labor chapter of any trade agreement in the world, not just in the United States. And that was a legacy that I think we need to build on and strengthen and figure out. But meanwhile, all the programs of the International Labor Affairs Bureau that I ran have been ended, terminated, without any. And so we're not going to be able to do some of the work that we used to do. So I feel like transparency, inclusion of stakeholders, inclusion of Congress are absolutely essential. Otherwise, it's random. Like, we don't know what the goals of these bilateral agreements are. We don't know if environment, consumer safety, labor protections, subsidies, other unfair trade practices are being talked about, or if it's just, looking at tariff levels or, golf courses.
I want to come to you, Congressman, here to talk about the politics of the moment. The politics around trade, to me, are endlessly fascinating just because it doesn't break down cleanly on party lines. You yourself are trying to thread this needle here, where some tariffs are good and productive, others not so much. Democrats right now, it seems, have been handed a bit of a golden moment because you have Trump campaigned very heavily on the economy, won the election, many folks feel based on the economy, and now his policies are wreaking a bit of havoc. And so do you think Democrats are seizing this moment effectively? Do they have a clear message?
Well, Democrats having a clear message is always a struggle, but I think when the other side, as it were, in politics is messing up, it makes it a little easier. And I say that as a guy from Western Pennsylvania, from steel country, from part of the world that knows what it is to see trade done poorly. When I can criticize the president's tariff approach, that tells you something about where Democrats are. I don't think it's enough just to say the other guy's messing up. And you mentioned that the politics are a little scrambled. I'm 40, whatever that makes me in the world. You go back and look at the original vote on NAFTA. Yes, the parties sorted, more Democrats opposed than Republicans, but there was a lot of geographic differences more than even partisan ones, which tells me something about the people who bear the cost of good or bad trade policy and where they live. My part of the world bore a lot of this cost. So I want Democrats to get this right. When I'm talking about targeted enforcement paired with real muscular industrial policy, that is what I think is what our answer should be. It's improving on some things the Biden administration did. We can't just say he's bad, let's go back to that. I think we got to do it better. I've put out a bunch around, say, shipbuilding and steel that are sectors we've got to invest in here and home, push back on the subsidies that I think break the law in China or otherwise, and think about how China and other countries then circumvent coming in through Mexico is one place, right? Where if this president's going to go back to the negotiating table on USMCA, and I think he should, that has to be something that we renegotiate with the Mexicans to block countries like China from circumventing our own trade restrictions that come back in through the USMCA.
And are your Democratic colleagues, you think, bought in on that vision? And how do you get to a bipartisan place?
Some, not all. And I think my Republican counterparts would say the same about the president's approach to trade. And again, I spent lots of time in my district after President Trump announced all these tariffs. In a place like Western Pennsylvania, for me to hear from union workers, small business owners, manufacturers, all who having a lot of pain from what the president announced tells you something. And so, yes, I think there's an opportunity for Democrats to not just criticize, but have our own better vision for trade.
Well, we joked before coming out here that we were going to solve the manufacturing problem, and I feel like we did it with a minute to spare. Listen, I want to say thank you to Congressman, to Thea, to Gilbert for being here to help me through this discussion, and thank you all for joining us today. Up next for our final session, please join me in welcoming Republican Senator Ron Johnson, who'll be taking the stage with Politico economics correspondent and columnist Victoria Guida.